When Fire Emblem Engage first was announced, I made a video talking about how I wasn't excited for it. I wasn't a fan of Alir's hairstyle, and I felt like the rings incorporating past heroes was a bit too similar to Fire Emblem Heroes, which alongside the lower movement ranks made me think that we were just getting FEH, the console version. However, once the game came out, I actually found myself enjoying it. I very soon after made a video about how Engage was my favorite Fire Emblem. The gameplay was incredibly satisfying, in particular with emblem rings opening up far more gameplay possibilities than any previous title had had. And the enemies were threatening enough that you had to take advantage of at least some number of these tools. Maddening mode in particular felt incredibly challenging and yet incredibly fair. With most Fire Emblem games on their highest difficulty, it can feel like it was not playtested at all. But if you take a close look at Engage, you can constantly see areas in which the design feels incredibly well tuned. The most famous of these is of course Etier one-rounding all of the flyers in her join chapter, but on the following map, she's 3 points short, which allows her to take advantage of Divinely Inspiring to do the same thing. And that same map is also a good subtle tutorial for Warp, by placing Celica onto Celine and her retainers in an isolated island in need of assistance. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely portions of Engage that feel like they were rushed. The UX is awful, and the back half of the campaign does have some true stinkers as far as maps are concerned. And the reclassing system feels very tacked on. But on the whole, I would say that I still am a big fan of Engage's gameplay loop, and it remains in my top 5 Fire Emblem games. Not just because its gameplay is good, but also because it feels like a fitting love letter to the franchise, stuffed full of cute references. Some of them in your face, like Micaiah giving knives because of the sages and Tellius getting knives, and some of them more subtle, like Ike's Lagoo's friend reducing a void to 0 because of the chapter where he rescues Leanne. And I'm even a half-hearted defender of Engage's story. I really don't like the end of the story. Basically everything from the reveal about Alir's true parentage onwards feels very bad to me. But before then, it's a perfectly serviceable, light-hearted treasure hunt tale that serves its purpose of giving you a reason to visit all of the different countries in Ilios. Sure, it's not the most mature story in the franchise, but if Three Houses taught us anything, it's that intelligent systems really can't handle writing mature characters, and the Fire Emblem fanbase especially cannot handle nuance when it comes to analyzing stories in the franchise. So I think a more lighthearted tale was probably the correct direction to go, especially if the game aims to be a celebration of everything from Fire Emblem history. It's much easier to work in cute references if you're not trying to tell the darkest story imaginable. I even like the upbeat and energetic anime intro. It immediately sets the tone for a fun, low-stakes adventure. And that is what 2/3 of the plot delivers, in my opinion. Like I said, I don't like the whole every villain gets redemption on their deathbed, and the introduction of Zero Emblem and all the silliness that comes with that is very off-putting to me, but the majority of the story works for me. Despite what an army of angry YouTubers would have you believe, the writing is not so bad that it detracts from the gameplay. Although there is one thing that had a concrete negative impact on my opinion of Fire Emblem Engage. Because when the Fell Xenologue DLC campaign was released, I decided to take a crack at it. I started in hard mode, not wanting to immediately dive into Lunatic, and found that these maps were even more brutal than I expected. I struggled my way through chapters 1 and 2, and then tried my hand at chapter 3 several times, only to eventually quit after 8 hours of bashing my head against a brick wall. The maps just felt so much harder than the main campaign, and not in a fun way. It's possible that this is a skill issue. I wouldn't describe myself as some sort of Fire Emblem super genius, but I'm also not a newbie. At this point, I had already beaten Engage on Lunatic multiple times. While I was doing attempt after attempt after attempt at Xenologue 3, I could feel my frustration leaking into my overall opinion on Fire Emblem Engage, and eventually decided that I just didn't need to finish the campaign. I knew it wasn't for me, and if I kept trying at it, I potentially risked coming away hating Fire Emblem Engage. So I put down Xenologue, and I resolved to never touch it again. But then I made a potentially fatal mistake. You see, recently we had a CO2 leak that resulted in a pretty huge expense in getting our furnace replaced. We didn't really have the money to afford doing this, but we also couldn't afford not doing it. CO2 is not something you fuck around with. So I decided to do a playthrough of Fire Emblem Engage, where people could pay money to sabotage me in various ways, such as reclassing units or changing the difficulty. I thought it would be a funny joke to put a reward for $1,000 to force me to play Xenologue. After all, surely no one would be financially irresponsible enough to spend $1,000 to torture a streamer. And if anyone doesn't know what, if someone doesn't know what outfits there are available and, pays for one, are you fucking kidding me, Mulder? No!
Mulder7511 donated $1,000. Smell Xenologue 3.
First off, are you kidding me? Positive. Thank you. Holy shit. Thank you, Mulder, for $1,000. But also, are you kidding me? Negative. Now we have to play the Smell Xenologue. Well, shit. Okay, I guess I can just dial the difficulty down to normal and blitz my way through it. It won't be fun, but it won't be terribly torturous, right? Actually, you know what? No, I'll sell out. I'll play on hard for another 1,000. You know, sometimes I even surprise myself with my idiocy. Bitch. Thank you. Genuinely thank you. But also, genuinely fuck you.
Here we go. Thickmolder7511 has just tipped $1,000. Hard 3.
I thought you were joking. I thought you said I won. No. Yeah, I forgot the cardinal rule. Don't fuck with Mulder. Alright, let's fucking do this thing then. Hard mode. It won't be as bad as the vanilla hard experience, as another viewer kindly paid to turn Phoenix mode mod on, so all of my units do respawn at the end of every turn, except for Nil and Nell, who are still game over conditions. For some reason, Alear is affected by Phoenix mode, but Nil and Nell are not. I don't understand why, but I'll take it. My initial thought was that it had to do with the mod being made prior to DLC, but it also affects Gregory and the other wins, so yeah, your guess is as good as mine. But since the reward was paid for after we completed the Yunaka map, I immediately dived into Xenologue Chapter 1, and was faced with a pack of hungry wolves assaulting my incredibly small squad of units. In addition to Byleth, Alear, and Nell, I was allowed to bring 2 people from the main cast, so I elected for Louis and Yunaka, as they were my strongest available combat units. But even after selecting the 2 most statistically strong units I had, as well as giving everyone emblems, I was at a distinct disadvantage compared to what the Xenologue was designed around. And that's because despite the DLC campaign unlocking in between Chapter 6 and 7, it was clearly balanced with an endgame team in mind. Theoretically, your units are scaled as you move through the Fel Xenologue. They receive auto levels, but these auto levels are distributed somewhat unevenly. Because while it is true that everyone in the cast gets leveled up to level 15, they're leveled up to level 15 in whatever class they start in. And that means the pre-promoted units get to be promoted level 15, whereas the unpromoted units have to start as unpromoted level 15. Thus, if I began my journey of torture later in the campaign, once I had access to units like Zelkov and Panette, I would gain a large number of auto levels on them. But unfortunately, as my current squad was, the only promoted unit was Vander, who was a level 15 paladin, and a level 15 paladin Vander is not actually that good. Yunaka and Louis were going to have to do. But despite his best efforts at choking all of the points, Louis was not able to survive the onslaught of wolves, and while Phoenix Mode did bring him back, anytime that they pushed past him, they would immediately one-round Nil, resulting in a game over. And Nell didn't fare too much better, as she got two-rounded by the wolves. In theory, the idea behind these two units was that you give them some of your emblem rings to make use of dragon bonuses. So even though neither of them is particularly adept at combat, they can help you in the utility role. Unfortunately, this design is somewhat compromised by the fact that Nil and Nell cannot build rank with any of the emblem rings or bracelets outside of the main campaign. And you cannot use Nil and Nell in the main campaign until you've already completed Fel Xenologue. As a result of this, Nil and Nell are kind of just dead weight. While Nell can survive a round of combat in this chapter and a couple of others, she's not dealing much damage in retaliation, and Nil is always getting one-rounded by every enemy on the map. And I can't even rely on these two chuckle fucks to finish off weakened enemies, because of the other major bugbear that will continue to harass me throughout Fel Xenologue. That being the accuracy issues. Because in addition to your squad mates having automatic levels and stats assigned to them, they also have automatic equipment. You can trade this equipment around both on the map and in the prep screen, although unfortunately Nil, Nell, and the Winds cannot participate in any of this trading. But you can't bring any items from the convoy, whether they be weapons, consumables, or staves. And as a result of this, you're stuck using whatever equipment has been handed to you. And the equipment handed to you is usually pretty bad. Here in Chapter 1, most characters have a steel version of their weapon equipped. And because we're expected to fight some fast enemies, steel weapons are certainly far from ideal. Even Yunaka, who is my most accurate unit, is hovering around the 90% mark. And everyone else is cosplaying as Binding Blade characters. When you're limited to 3 competent combat units, you really can't afford to take any inaccurate attacks. But unfortunately, that's exactly what Fel Xenologue demands of you. And the turn wheel doesn't even help that much with the accuracy issue, because with only 3 people able to launch attacks safely, you just don't have that many options for re-rolling RNG. And the combination of this low accuracy and the low deployment count meant that even with cheater-style Phoenix Mode activated, I had to use turn wheel enough times that I almost ran out. Louis clutched up and used his emblem Rider's Bane in order to kill Fogato. And if you're wondering why I had to kill Fogato, well, I should probably touch on the story. Alir got isekai'd into an alternate dimension where everyone is dead. Sombron won, but also died, and Alir died at the same time. They, stabbed each other and died on each other's swords or some shit. The only living characters are Nil, Nell, and the 4 Winds. But large swaths of the population have been revived as corrupted who are not aware that they died yet. Nil and Nell tell us about some secret mystery foe and say that we need to gather the 7 bracelets in order to stop the mystery foe from taking advantage of them for reasons. Who fucking knows? Also, Nell hates us because we are the gender-swapped version of her boyfriend, so that's kinda cool, I guess. After this expedition dump, a mysterious stranger shows up and sends wolves to kill us. We're not supposed to know the stranger is Fogato, but he is, so spoilers. But if Chapter 1 was that brutal, I don't think I'm prepared for the rest of the campaign. So I negotiated with Mulder and he agreed to let me delay Fel Xenologue until after Chapter 9. That way I get the Brodians and their retainers, as well as 2 more emblems in Leaf and Roy. So I used my EXP Thief Vander to speedrun Chapters 7, 8, and 9. And then I did 3 speedruns of Legend of Jean. But unfortunately, I couldn't delay things any longer, so it was time to dive back down the well into hell. Chapter 2 kicks off our grand quest to grab the remaining bracelets from all of the kingdoms that have them. And so, much like in the main campaign, our first destination is Firene, where we meet the opposite versions of Alfred and Celine. Instead of his normal confident self, Alfred is instead scared and timid, basically a puppet ruler to his sister Celine, who is the real power behind the throne. And unlike her normal peace-loving self, Celine is warmongering. And in fact, Firene in general is now an aggressive nation against the peace-loving Brodia, flip-flopping the two nations' roles in the story. But we also get some hints that these characters are not simply the exact opposite of the royals, but instead Fel Alfred and Fel Saline are kind of a twisted reflection of what our Alfred and Saline could become in a different timeline. Because after their retainers died, they were left traumatized and alone, to stew with the worst parts of their personalities. While our Alfred reacted to his disease by diving into workouts in order to strengthen his body, this Alfred instead became a walking ball of anxiety. And Saline took the love of the Firenese people to a dark logical extent. She is going to conquer the other nations to make sure that her people are safe and prosperous. And I actually quite like this idea. There's a lot of semi-dark features in Engage's background that don't ever get brought to the surface or fully explored. And so Xenologue giving us a peek into how these people might actually get messed up is pretty cool. And there's some good writing to go alongside it. Not in the main story, but in some of the boss conversations. Like, I don't even particularly care for Louis or Saline as characters, but this convo goes pretty hard.
It's hard to see my former retainer on this battlefield. It's as if you've come back to life.
I had hoped to only watch you from afar, but that is easier said than done in battle.
Do you remember the tea you once brewed for me? I've been unable to drink it since you died. I can no longer remember just how happy I was. Could you remind me before you sleep forever?
How I wish that I could. However, I do not have that right, Princess Saline.
But we don't just get the opposite version of Alfred and Saline in this chapter, because Celestia, the good version of Zephia, joins us. Celestia does not have a very good explanation for why she is the opposite in this universe compared to the other. Technically, Zephia had a weird deathbed redemption where she said the only reason that she was evil was because I truly loved the Four Fangs like they were my family. Oh, sorry, did I say Four Fangs? I meant the Four Riders. Oh shit, no, it's the Four Winds? No, the Four Hounds. Why the fuck is everything in fours in Fire Emblem? So, the idea is that her caring in this world is a lot more genuine, but I'll be honest, I never bought the line about her caring about the Four Hounds anyway. Like, this reveal was delivered a chapter after she just brutally murdered Marnie for basically no reason. Honestly, the Four Winds kind of just read like the worst sort of fan service. People complained about the fact that the Four Hounds were some of the only named characters that weren't playable, and so Intelligent Systems decided to make them playable. It's weird, and I don't care for any of the wins. And while satisfying gameplay can go a long way towards correcting an off-putting personality, as we saw with Camilla in Fire Emblem Fates, the Hounds don't receive the benefit of a good introduction. Celestia, at the very least, has a unique class, that being a flying class with tome and sword access. She feels similar to Ivy, although she trades staves for swords, which is mostly a downgrade. Although, I handed her the Levin sword that Saline starts with, in hopes that she could make good use of it. Unfortunately, in order to make good use of the Levin sword, Celestia would have to actually hit her foes. And she's consistently scoring 70s and below in terms of the hit rates. And that's after gaining stats from the level boost from Roy. Steel Swords and El Thunder are just not suited for dealing with dodgy enemies. Because Engage doesn't have a weapon triangle that affects hit, my tools to fix accuracy are quite limited. The only possible option is to inherit the hit boosting skills from Sigurd Emblem, which not only costs me resources in the main campaign in the form of SP, but also isn't available for any of the preset characters. So Celestia is just going to have to struggle to hit the broadside of a barn for the remainder of her time. Still, rushing down and killing the Firenese royals is relatively trivial for me, although bolstered in great deal by the fact that I can just ignore when my units die. If I didn't have Phoenix mode enabled, then this would probably be a whole lot more difficult, because I am both statistically and numerically outmatched by a great deal. And not only that, but this is the map that is meant to introduce you to the Enchanter class. Enchanters can consume tonics to give allies nearby a variety of boosts, and these boosts are all, if you'll excuse my language, fucking bullshit. Enemies gain the ability to reflect back either physical or magical damage like its counter from Awakening, but here they don't even have the benefit of locking it to be one range. There's also a boost that just straight up gives a 30% chance to ignore damage dealt. You know, as if the accuracy issues were not bullshit enough. Let's just reintroduce Pavise from Fire Emblem 4. Everybody's favorite skill, right? The only other notable feature on this map is it introduces treasure chests, which is a weird inclusion because the Fel Xenologue does not let you keep items from chapter to chapter. I guess theoretically what you get from these chests is supposed to be helpful in chapter 2. Those tools being a Rider's Bane and a Physic. Rider's Bane lets you deal effective damage to Alfred, so that's pretty cool, but I already have one from Sigurd. And I actually didn't even get the Physic, because rather than split my forces in half and fight in both the south and north, I decided to combine everyone together and charge up north. The reason for this? Well, half of my units are fucking worthless. Nil, and Celestia are just not doing a good enough job for me to split my forces up. Overall, I would probably say that this is the best map in Fel Xenologue, not because the map itself is particularly good. On its own merits, I would still say that this is a very trash map, but it lacks in the particular level of bullshit that the other maps will bring along. The most frustrating thing is dealing with the enchanters, but enchanters will return in Chapter 5, and they are even more frustrating there. Here, I just kind of ignored them, although again, if I wasn't working with Phoenix mode, maybe my opinion would change. Still, after defeating the Firenays and recovering their bracelet, I had been streaming for 6 hours. It was getting close to dinner time, so I decided to delay the invasion of Brodia until the following stream. But this is where things went from bad to worse. Chapter 3 is a large vertical bridge map meant to take place in the same location as Chapter 7 of the main story, but rotated 90 degrees. Your forces start at the very bottom and need to charge all the way up top to kill the two bosses, Alchrist and Diamant, but along the way you will be pelted with a series of Mage Cannoneers. Mage Cannoneers are an artillery class that can fire weak shots that inflict a variety of status effects from a long distance, up to 7 tiles away. When they're far away, their hit rates are not great, usually around a 30% chance. But while low accuracy attacks are unacceptable on the player's hand, because if you miss, you don't get anything out of them, in the enemy's hands, they are a lot more threatening, especially when you have the number that this enemy does. The overlapping ranges means that these cannoneers can often chip away at your forces before you can approach them, and that's the ones that you can't even safely approach. There are a series of mage cannoneers located on towers that only flyers can reach, also guarded by longbow units who the flyers cannot one-round. And of course, each mage cannoneer protects another mage cannoneer, in addition to their ranges just overlapping with each other's naturally. The chip damage is also relevant for protecting Nil, who is even frailer than before. He gets one-rounded by every regular enemy on the map, but also two-rounded in hard mode by the mage cannoneers. So in addition to having to carve out safe spaces for him, you have to make sure that these spaces are not in the range of the mage cannoneers. Otherwise, he risks getting killed anyway. But with flyers approaching from the left, right, and bottom of the map, it's going to be hard enough to keep Nil in safety before factoring in the mage cannoneers. And Nil isn't the only unit who can get completely fucked up by this enemy type. The various status effects can cripple your army, including Silence, which turns off a mage for a turn if they're hit by it. And you're guaranteed to have at least one mage on this map, because Gregory is the force deployed unit. Gregory is a high magic, high speed unit, but his accuracy is awful. Think Nyx from Fire Emblem Fates, but much like everything else about Fel Xenologue, you don't have the tools to fix his problems. No weapon triangle, no hit plus 10, no forges or engraving, no nothing. He's stuck using the steel weapon equivalents and having terrible accuracy. At this point, when I was struggling against the map that made me quit the first time, I started thinking about potential solutions to the accuracy problem. And honestly, I think it's a little bit weird that the 4 wins don't start with support rank with each other, or with Nell and Nil. Getting plus 10 hit from support adjacency wouldn't fix all of the issues, but at least would go a little bit of a ways towards addressing them. You could even potentially make it only be active during Fel Xenologue. That way you can justify having the 3-tier conversations in the main campaign. I mean, Lord knows everything else about your units is exclusive to the Xenologue. Their levels and classes are locked in specific stages that are not going to reflect the main campaign. And speaking of which, this is the chapter where the auto-leveling starts running into some funkiness. Because this is the map where all of your unpromoted units promote into level 1 promoted. This is a pretty huge gain for them, although some of the canon choices are a little bit questionable. The biggest standout is Anna for some reason becomes a berserker despite having innate bow proficiency, but I guess they thought the radiant bow would be too strong. But the bigger questionable element behind this decision is it means that the pre-promoted units actually get de-leveled and become weaker compared to how they were in Chapter 2. They were level 18 promoted in Chapter 2, but now they're reduced down to level 1. In theory, I guess the idea might be that you have to change up your squad between missions, but in practice, the level 1 promoted units that are pre-promotes are still better than most of the growth units. Jean is particularly tragic, as his stats are just not that good in comparison to the other units, despite the fact that he is supposed to be the game's trainee. I had some people in chat say that his skill aptitude is just not correctly applying to the auto levels, and I don't know if that's true. I couldn't find anything confirming it online, but I'll be honest, whether aptitude applies or not, Jean getting the aptitude bonus from the Martial Monk line is not doing him any favors. Martial Monk is just not a great class to be in. It's for utility, not growths. But now that all of our units are promoted, if you want the staff utility, you can just use one of the promoted sages. Actually tackling the map itself was an RNG fest nightmare. In addition to having to pray that I dodge enough of the mage cannoneers not to get statused into oblivion, there was also the shaky accuracy that my bow and Elwind users had against the various wyverns. And while one solution to shaky accuracy is to try to take things slow, Xenologue 3 doesn't give you this option. As I mentioned, reinforcement flyers come from behind, and there's nowhere safe to hide Nil. So if you don't push forward fast enough to clear out the mage cannoneers and outrun the enemy flyers, you're going to be staring down the bad end of a game over. But the accuracy issues actually get worse than pulling 70% against wyverns, believe it or not. Because Alchrist is a covert unit who starts on terrain, and even Diamant is going to take significant advantage of the avoid terrain. You can use engage attacks to try to wear the two of them down, but otherwise your options are just hoping and praying that sometimes sub 50% are able to hit. And the Brodian brothers are not even your only problems. Diamant has Veronica, so he will summon Marth and Sigurd does get the super boost from Cantor. So once again, good luck finding somewhere Nil can stand for free. And it's not like the rest of your units are much safer. Marth has divine speed, so he's gonna fuck you up with 4 hits. Despite the fact that I was able to take advantage of Phoenix mode to have all of my units basically immortal, I still struggled to complete this map, and was just barely able to land 3 60% hits on Diamant in a row in order to take down his final health bar. This map does feel like it has some cool ideas at the core of it. The reinforcements rushing you from behind encourage you to move fast, which is always good in a Fire Emblem game. But you just don't have the tools to do that accurately. Likewise, I kind of like the idea of the long-range enemies pelting you with chip damage. But the combination of the Flyers and Mage Cannoneers doesn't give you anywhere safe to sit nil, and the status effects just make it way too swingy. Sometimes you're just gonna run into a situation where they have effectively deleted one of your units. That's one of the more frustrating elements of Fel Xenologue. It feels like it has some interesting ideas at its core, but every step along the way, they fumbled the execution harder than you can possibly imagine. And it's kind of bizarre to me that the enemy stats are so unbalanced in a mode where they know exactly what stats your units are going to have. Well, I guess technically they don't, because for some reason the skills and bond rank from the main campaign get brought into Fel Xenologue, but nothing else does. Everything else is fixed about your units. Well, technically which units you have alive are also a variable, but I don't know. It just feels really frustrating, especially given how the Three Houses DLC took advantage of knowing what limited tools you had access to in order to craft a much more refined campaign. God, is this what the Fel Xenologue reduced me to? I just made a "here's how Three Houses succeeded while Engage failed" talking point. I guess on that topic, we should dive into the story, though. We are now introduced to Gregory, the good version or Fel version of Gris from our world. The cutscene is a little bit awkward because it needed to be recorded in such a way that Alir could possibly have met Gris in the main campaign, but also possibly could not have. At least with Zephia, you know that Alir encountered them in Fiorni's castle. But with Gris, it's just kind of, I don't know. It feels like, once again, they should have just set this campaign as taking place at a specific point in the Fire Emblem Engage story. Like, if you could access it from a menu and have it take place at a point where Alir already knows who the hounds are, then you could make these scenes a lot more impactful. But if you did that, then you wouldn't be able to use the bond rank as an excuse to not balance your fucking game mode. Anyway, Gregory takes the same approach as Celestia, where he's just the opposite of Gris for no adequately explored reason. Gris is a BDSM freak who loves pain, whereas Gregory is a coward who's afraid of ever getting hurt. I do feel the need to point out that these are not technically opposites, as I fall into both categories, but Fel Xenologue's writing has enough issues without me being a nitpicker. Anyway, we get chased by a scouting party and hide in a cave, and then the scouting party finds us, and it turns out that the scouting party is led by Diamant and Alchrist. Diamant has undergone the same change that Alfred did. Now he's a cowardly leader and basically a puppet to his sibling. Meanwhile, Alchrist is incredibly aggressive and just plain old mean to everyone around him. He calls Diamant a failure multiple times, and while this is ostensibly the opposite to Alchrist on our plane, his boss conversation with Citrine reveals that he is actually just channeling his own insecurity outwards instead of inwards, and he's very much the same emo boy that we know and love. In fact, the conversation between Alchrist and Citrine is one of the best pieces of writing in Fel Xenologue, and the writing is elevated even further by the brilliant performances of Micah Seleucid and Brittany Karbowski. Just take a listen to this.
Citrine? It hurts to see you now, knowing I failed to keep you safe. Everyone in your noble house died too. They were like family. Each death.
I half expected it, but here we are. I feel such sorrow every time you look at me that way.
No matter your wealth, life itself remains irreplaceable. The cause of so much suffering. I should have died that day. I wanted you to live. I wanted everyone to live.
The Alchrist of this world looks so confident. Yet at heart, you're just like the one I know. I'm sure you did your best. As painful as it was, I'm glad that I was the one to go first.
Honestly, every time I listen to the convo, I tear up a little, and that's not an exaggeration. Now, as the retainers all seem to have conversations with their evil lords, I thought it would be cool to check out Amber and Diamant's. Amber is one of my favorite units to use, and while he's pretty goofy and a little bit one-dimensional, he has grown on me a lot as a character. Unfortunately, his conversation with Diamant was pretty generic. I can't necessarily blame the writing team. Amber, despite my love for him, is not the deepest character in the cast. But it was definitely a little bit disappointing on a personal level. At the very least, next chapter we have Marin, Timerra, and Penette, and I love all three of these characters, not only because their dynamic with each other is great, but because they contain that trademark hidden depth that modern Fire Emblem seems to love putting behind its supports. And so far, while the writing of the main story has been pretty lackluster, at least I have been able to count on interesting depictions of what dark and fucked up versions of these royals would look like. So I'm curious, is Timerra going to take her independence and crime fighting a bit too far and decide that she doesn't need to follow society's rules, ending up as something of an anti-hero vigilante? Will losing her two retainers, who are hinted at having romantic feelings for her, drive her over the edge to where she sees everyone as a brigand, not just the one stealing? No, of course not. Instead, we get...
Don't you remember how you hated animals? I'm a vegetarian, and you know I hate music. You always were scared of brave ones.
Yeah, we have officially passed the point where Xenologue has anything good to offer us in the story. Although I did skip a few steps. After we complete Chapter 3, we reclaim Veronica's bracelet from Diamant. However, once we leave, Nell comes back and asks Alchrist and Diamant if they know who was behind the attack in Chapter 1. Since the brothers do not have any information, she says they're not useful anymore and just fucking kills them. At this point in the story, we, the player, do not necessarily know that the entire world is full of corrupted, although you could have figured this out based on the fact that all of the enemies are corrupted subtype. I think this is a clever idea executed kind of poorly, because as long as you have Emblem Celica, you will always see that they're corrupted because it highlights them as soon as you engage, since you can do effective damage to them now. Still, the red herring is that Nell is secretly the villain, and that's why she's killing all of these royals. And I'll admit, I fell for it. Moving on to Chapter 4 though, we meet up with this universe's version of Marnie and Mavier. Those being Madeline and Mavier. Yeah, for some reason Mavier wasn't changed at all. I guess because we already recruit Mavier in the main campaign. Spoilers apparently, at least according to the fucking tier list. Although that does bring up the interesting question of why the hounds all got given different names. Alchrist and Timerra and Diamant are all their opposites in this universe, but they still have the same names. And yet Madeline, Celestia, and Gregory all for some reason changed their names. God, again, this feels like a nitpick, but the number of small, weird inconsistencies present in this story just add up to make it significantly worse than it has to be, and it's already not great. As for Madeline, she's kind of just the nice version of Marnie. Weirdly, in the chapter where the royals suddenly became opposite caricatures, the one hound that we get a new personality of feels like just a different development. She's still very much into praise, but rather than doing all these evil things to get praised, she fulfills her knightly duty. Or at least she tries to, because from a gameplay perspective, she's not fulfilling shit. She has the worst dex of any unit in the game, and considering the hounds are already batting uphill when it comes to accuracy, this means she's consistently facing 20 to 30% hit rates. Chapter 4 does at least upgrade our equipment to be silvers and tomahawks, except for some fucking reason, Gregory and Celestia's starting equipment does not upgrade, and they're still stuck a tier behind on steels. I don't... okay, my conspiracy theory is that it's because Gregory and Celestia joined earlier, so they have the equipment from their join maps, but it's just so fucking laughable. God, Xenologue, did you even fucking playtest this shit? God! The map itself is a three-way battle, similar to the iconic Battle of Elin Lion. Timerra and Ivy's forces are facing down against each other, and your job is to kill both leaders. In theory, this is a pretty cool concept. You can manipulate the armies into fighting each other before finishing off a weakened foe. But in practice, this map takes the accuracy issues I've been complaining about for the previous 3 chapters and dials them up to 11. Even though we have 5 more hit from the upgraded weapons, enemies are significantly faster, and the terrain is full of forests, so there's plenty of times that they just get extra avoid because of how the map is laid out. It's a particularly bad first impression for Madeline, but honestly, even the non-wind characters are struggling with their hit rates. Previously, the baseline was around 80 to 90%, which is still not great, but now oftentimes people are facing 60s and 70s. And a lot of the enemy stats just feel careless. Like, since the developers knew what our unit's stats would be working with, you would expect situations like, oh, this archer is able to one round, or using a wind tome against the flyers is going to be good, or doubling the armors with Excalibur to one round them, or the armor slayer that you get access to. But no, instead there are so many kill thresholds where using the correct weapon against the correct enemy type just gets you 1 or 2 points short. And again, I was playing on hard mode, so I imagine on Lunatic these numbers were even worse. But perhaps the worst number wasn't the hit rates or the damage, but the number of enemies on the map. Before the map begins, the settings automatically change some stuff with the animations because of the sheer number of units on the battlefield. I understand that compromises need to be made if you're trying to do such a large-scale battle, but it is kind of telling of just how much the scope of this map was outside of what the Switch and Fire Emblem Engage were able to handle, because even with these forced animation changes, there is a lot of lag. Anytime I pulled up the turn wheel, it took about half a second to scroll through just one action. Your experience may vary, but the Switch's hardware just does not seem strong enough to take this many units on. But even if miraculously you're one of those people who never ran into any lag or glitches in Scarlet and Violet, you're still going to be taking a long time every enemy phase, well, both enemy phases, because the sheer number of units who move and the slowness of map animations just drags things out. I found myself spamming the skip button, and that's before factoring in the number of times I would rewind in order to have to adjust movements because, you guessed it, accuracy issues. Like with everything else, there is a cool idea at its core. I really liked Battle of Eagle and Lion, and I appreciated that this take on the map didn't have the enemy units buff themselves from getting kills, so you were actually encouraged to take advantage of the yellow versus red aggression. Whereas in Battle of Eagle and Lion, that was considered bad because of the morale boosts. But unfortunately, everything else about this map just kind of falls flat. It's way too big, there's way too many forests, there's way too many enemies, and there's way too few hit rates. Still, this map is up there with Chapter 2 in contention for the least bad of the Fel Xenologue maps. I think if it were running on a more powerful hardware, or they just reduced the number of units on the map by about 10%, it would probably be my favorite of the 6. Even if it does have the unfortunate connotation of being linked to Chapter 5. You see, the 2 major plot twists are revealed at the end of Chapter 4. The first is that all of the people in the world are dead. We're fighting over a dead world. This I previously mentioned, and the player reasonably could have figured out based on their tags on the battlefield. But the second, and more relevant twist, is that actually Nil is the main villain of Fel Xenologue. He's tired of feeling like a weakling who gets one-rounded by everything and wants to fulfill Sombron's will. And I'm not just making an offhanded joke, that is legitimately the reason that he's gone evil. He doesn't like being weak, and thinks if he's evil, he won't be weak anymore. It's silly. He kidnaps Alir and then locks Nell and the 4 Winds in a tomb full of corrupted. Nell escapes and goes to confront him, leaving the 4 Winds behind to die. This leads directly into Chapter 5, similar to Chapters 10 and 11 or 21 and 22 in the main campaign. Basically, what this means is you're not allowed to leave Fel Xenologue Chapter 5 and return to the main campaign. And I'll be honest, I think that this choice was really dumb. The linked chapters in the main campaign work really well because they present a feeling of cohesion. You go in with one army and then have to leave with that same army. You're not allowed to redeploy units who were not deployed in Chapter 10 in Chapter 11. Same goes for Chapter 22. And moreover, if somebody died in the first of the 2 linked chapters, then you're just a man down for the second one. The inability to return to the Somniel and make further preparations just adds to the narrative element that you are continuing one big, large story event. And similarly, this means that you're not allowed to do any paralogs in between these chapters, so the experience you have at the end of Chapter 10 is always going to be what you have at the beginning of 11. However, as with basically all elements, the Fel Xenologue only goes halfway. It doesn't let you leave Chapter 5 without having to redo Chapter 4 again, but there's no other limitations. You can deploy a completely different squad in Chapter 5 than Chapter 4. In fact, there's a different number of deployment slots between the 2 maps. Because the campaign is forced casual mode, you don't even have deaths carry over into the next chapter. And there's really no such thing as battle preparations, because all of your equipment gets reset in between each Fel Xenologue chapter. There's not even really a good narrative justification for why you can't go back to the main campaign. Because yes, Alir is prisoner, which means that Alir should not be able to leave to return to the Somniel, but the same was true during the other chapters. Not Alir being prisoner, but Alir not being able to leave. You see, the Somniel in the main campaign is explained as somewhere that Alir can always teleport to no matter what. But in this campaign, you are in a completely different world, and as a result of that, untethered from the Somniel. The campaign actually makes a point of the fact that the portal between worlds only exists within the castle that you start in. Because at the end of Chapter 6, it's meaningful that a new portal to Alir's world opens up. As a result of this, there's no reason that Alir should be able to return back to the main campaign in between Chapters 2 and 3, when the group is journeying from Firene to Brodia. So if the linked chapters don't add anything from a story perspective, and they also don't add anything from a gameplay perspective, why the fuck are they here? And my suspicion is just that the linked chapters were popular in the main campaign, so they threw a couple into the Xenologue. Because Chapter 10 and 11 are genuinely great, and while I'm not a huge fan of the 21-22 shift, it's definitely cool to have you go all the way up the map in one chapter, and then work your way back down in the next. But ultimately, the linked nature of these chapters wouldn't be a big deal if it weren't for the fact that Chapter 5 is absolute fucking bullshit. True to the plot, Nell and Nil are isolated and fighting each other in the top right of the map. In the middle of the map, an Alir that is not under your control stands captive, and just remains standing still for the entirety of the map. Meanwhile, the units you've chosen to deploy all start in the top left, and have to wind their way through a series of twisting hallways in order to reach the duel between Nell and Nil. Because even if you give her a strong emblem, Nell does not stand a chance of wearing down Nil on her own. He has 3 health bars thanks to revival crystals, and there are constantly spawning healers with mend and physics staffs to cure him all the way up. So your team has to quickly make their way through the winding hallways to interrupt this duel, because Nell has a limited number of elixirs. Of course, you could have someone act as the physic bot for her, but Alir is also going to need assistance, because while they are in an isolated room, a dragon will spawn and attack them from 4 range relentlessly. And of course, the return of mage cannoneers from Chapter 3 means that neither of these dragons are safe. But wait, if you thought the only frustrating parts about Chapter 5 were the isolated, frail units you need to protect, then you haven't been paying attention. Fel Xenologue is so much worse than that. Yes, once again, accuracy issues are going to plague you, but that's not even the only reason that your units will be bad at combat. I routinely had my characters getting fucking one-rounded by just standard enemies. I generally believe that most Fire Emblem games' highest difficulties are not thoroughly playtested, but this is hard mode. How the fuck do you screw the balance up this badly? I feel the need to emphasize that due to auto-leveling, they knew exactly what stats characters would have going into this. And yet, my archers are several points short of one-rounding flyers, and everyone is getting one-rounded by the opponent. And that's before factoring in the fact that, hey, enchanters are back. And if you thought your combat prospects against the enemies were bad, well, they can get a whole lot worse, because enchanters will give the reflect physical, reflect magical, and of course everybody's favorite, great shield. I was able to use human wave tactics to push my way through the hallway because of Phoenix mode, but most playthroughs will not be that lucky. Because you need 1 to 2 dedicated physic bots just to protect the dragons, which lowers your offensive capabilities, which is bad because, the enemies are an overwhelming force, and you are on a pretty strict timer. Now, you may think, okay, well, we'll just cheese things by warp Ragnarocking to interrupt the duel. But this is also a trap, because if you get close enough to Nell and Nil, a large number of reinforcements will spawn. And Nil has significant enough res that most warp Ragnaroks are going to be dealing 0 to him. Apparently, the most popular cheese strategy involves using Astrostorm, but even this isn't foolproof because, hey, he's got 3 health bars. There's also 2 sub-bosses on this map, those being Hortensia and Fogado. They're not even trying at doing the opposite theme with these two anymore. Hortensia is just a coward who kind of wants to die, and Fogado has become a murderous psychopath for no reason. And believe it or not, that's not even the only plot issue with these 2 characters. You see, the reason that Nil is holding Alir captive is so that he can blackmail Nell into giving him the other bracelets. Because Nell is actually in love with Alir, because Nell was in love with this universe's version of Alir before this universe's version of Alir died, and that's why Nell hates Alir, but then realizes that Alir and Alir are different, and so now she loves Alir. It's fucking complicated and stupid. Who cares about this soap opera shit? But anyway, the plot is very explicit about the fact that Nil only has 1 emblem ring, and that is the one that he has equipped himself. So why the fuck do Fogado and Hortensia also have emblem bracelets? It's the bare fucking minimum. You could very easily just have Nell give those 2 bracelets to Nil, or just not have Nil explicitly say, I only have 1 ring. Because initially, I assumed that when Nil became evil and kidnapped Alir, he also stole the bracelets. That just sort of made logical sense that that's how they were going to have you fight against the bracelets. But no, Nil goes out of his way to say, I only have 1 bracelet. And then he fucking has 3! What the fuck? God, this map is just such a fucking mess. In my playthrough, we did encounter 2 kind of interesting bugs. The first one is there is a fell wyvern that shows up on the south of the map and just doesn't have aggressive AI. There's nothing in the room that it's in either, so there's no reason to ever venture down there. It's just kind of silly? It's not the biggest deal in the world, but it shows a lack of polish that is just consistent for the absurdity that is the Fell Xenologue. But we did get some amount of joy out of the way that Phoenix mode interacted with this chapter. You see, I realized partway through I didn't have to keep healing Alir, as Phoenix mode meant that they were no longer a game over condition. So I just let Alir die. And because of the way that Phoenix mode works in Engage, it spawns you not quite on the space you died at, but usually 1 or 2 away from it. Well, the devs didn't design this map with an unofficial mod in mind. And so Alir spawned outside of the prison cell. And not only that, but she became under my control again. I was able to access the convoy and everything. Now, the convoy was empty because normally you don't get access to the convoy on this map. Yet another reason that it's kind of trash. So I had to send Saline backwards just to give Alir a weapon so that she could stop dying. But it was incredibly funny to have everyone be like, oh, we gotta rescue Alir! And Alir's just like, I'm right here, guys. Calm the fuck down. Unfortunately, that's the last ounce of joy I would be getting from Fell Xenologue. Because I decided to make the finale its own stream, and honestly, that map is bad enough that I probably could make it its own fucking video. Xenologue 6 once again has a really cool concept. Even right off the bat, I like the idea of battling in the Somniel. It's just such a fitting place for the finale. And as an enemy, Fel Neil also has a very cool concept behind him. He's jumping from altar to altar, invincible to all of your attacks, but occasionally prepares what I call a nuke and blows up the island that his altar is on before jumping to another. Any units who are on those altar, whether they are friend or foe, are immediately killed, and the more units he kills, the more powered up he gets. I don't know the exact math behind it, so I'm just repeating what chat told back to me, but apparently he gains additional revival crystals if he kills 3 or more units in a single nuke. He also can sometimes gain stats, but it's inconsistent according to chat. But also, chat are fucking liars, because they told me when he got to the final altar, I would be gifted an instant kill weapon that could one-round him, and their promised weapon dealt 9 damage to his 80 HP. So who knows, maybe everything they told me about the mechanics of the boss fight were a lie. They certainly didn't warn me about the one really interesting gimmick, and that is the fact that Fel Neil can gain skills. You see, all 8 of the royals are present as sub-bosses, and most of them have emblem bracelets, with only Hortensia being left out in the cold. Since each of the lords has a proc skill tied to their promoted class, whichever ones Nil kills, he will gain their skill. So, for example, if he kills Timerra, he gains Sandstorm, and if he kills Alchrist, he gains Luna. On a skeleton level, I think this is actually pretty cool. The idea that you need to kill these enemies before Nil does, or Nil will make himself stronger. And tying in the royal skills is a neat touch, although there is one skill that they decided was a bit too powerful. You see, Diamant's skill is Soul, which is a dex % chance to recover HP equal to half of the damage you deal. Since Nil deals quite a lot of damage and has an incredibly high dex of 34, meaning he would have a 1 out of 3 chance to proc this every single combat, you can see how this might lead to a situation where you're just rolling the slot machines a few too many times. So naturally, the devs decided to make it so that he wasn't able to get back at you from killing Fagato. Wait, what? Yeah, they decided that back at you, the skill % chance to proc counter was too powerful to risk giving to Nil, but they were perfectly fine with him getting Soul. No problems whatsoever here. Back at you is easily the worst of the proc skills. Like, even Sandstorm and Luna do more damage than Back at You is going to, especially considering just how stat creeped Nil is himself. So your attacks are often just minor chip damage, meaning that if they get flung back at you, you can kinda just shrug them off. So if Nil kills Fagato, instead of getting back at you, he just gets an extra invisible revival stone. And yes, you heard me right, it is invisible. Initially, when he lost his first health bar and didn't lose a revival stone, I thought the fight was bugged, but chat reassured me that this was a trait of him killing Fagato. And before you think that maybe the reason they gave him a revival stone instead of back at you was because they thought that back at you was too weak, and so they wanted to give you an actual incentive to kill Fagato, no, that's not the case, because he can get World Tree, even though this does literally nothing for him. Fel Neil getting access to Soul is basically a game over condition. Despite the fact that I had Phoenix mode enabled, I ended up having to reset a 3.5 hour long attempt because he got Soul, as my units were dealing single-digit damage even with engage attacks, whereas he was healing up 30 to 40 every time that he procced Soul, and he had a 1 out of 3 chance to proc Soul. I couldn't even get him down a single revival crystal, let alone the other 2. Someone in chat ran the numbers and told me I had less than a 1 in 100,000 chance. Although, to be fair, I'm not sure if these are accurate numbers. Now, if I had access to some of the stronger pre-promotes or had inherited some strong endgame skills with immense amounts of SP, I may be able to make those numbers look a little bit better. But it's still such an uphill battle that unless you have a specific loadout to cheese the boss, I don't really think it's worth trying, and you should consider him killing Diamant a game over condition. Now you might be wondering, why did I not initially reset after Nil killed Diamant? And the reason is that the game doesn't give you any indication that Nil killing the royals gives their skills to him. There's a tooltip that says he gets stronger if he kills a lot of enemies, but I thought this was just referring to statistical gains or else the revival crystals, each of which are factors that I can theoretically work around. Soul is not. There's just nothing I can do to mitigate it. If he decides he wants to recover HP, Nil is going to recover HP. The offensive skills were not a problem for me because I had cheater mode Phoenix mode on, but I imagine that Luna and Sandstorm would be equally problematic for anyone who didn't use hacks. But perhaps the biggest problem I had with the nukes destroying islands to gain stats and skills and revival crystals and all that stuff is just how little warning you get for the fact this is going to happen. You learn that an island is going to be nuked the turn before it happens. And as a result of that, you often run into situations where you can't get all of your units off the island. Remember, he only needs to kill 3 in order to gain a revival crystal. And that also means anyone you left on the island is gone for the rest of the map. There is a tooltip that informs you that the Xenologue is forced to play on casual mode, but why are you informing me of this in the final map? This tooltip should have been available in Chapter 1, but I don't know, it's Xenologue, who cares at this point? Now, there are a couple of enemies who drop rescue staffs, presumably to help with people who are trapped on islands. But because rescue only has 5 range, this does not become a viable solution. Your generals have 4 movement, your infantry have 5, and even the mounted units only have 6. The space covered by the nukes is so large that it is a frequent occurrence that you can just get caught unawares and have someone who is unable to escape the blast. The first time that the nukes showed up, Alir, Louis, and Jade were all trapped on an island, and I could only rescue one of them by moving Gregory backwards in order to yoink Alir to safety after Alir moved full move. This is just not good design. I get that it's supposed to be the final chapter and they want to crank up the difficulty, but difficulty needs to be something that you can actively fight against. Just saying, surprise, some of your units are dead, fuck you, is not good. That's not difficulty, that's just cruelty. And the RNG nature of the various proc skills, especially Soul, is similarly not a difficult challenge. Randomness does not equal difficulty, as much as your aunt who plays slot machines all day would like you to believe otherwise. In my second attempt, I decided to beeline for Diamant, killing him at all costs. After all, with Phoenix mode turned on, only Nell needs to be protected. I also gave Marth to Alir, as supposedly this is what would enable that one round. Spoilers, it doesn't. Which is where I ran into the other significant frustration on this map. In addition to all of the other issues from previous maps, like low accuracy and incredibly stat-creeped enemies, Xenologue 6 just takes a very long time. I was told that rushing ahead makes Nil jump from altar to altar sooner, but I'm not sure I believe that, because it took roughly 3 to 4 turns per altar for Nil to jump from altar to altar, no matter what I did, and this led to a while of me just standing around at the final altar since I'd cleared out all the enemies I cared about. There were, of course, a bunch of reinforcements who would show up around this altar because, of course, there were, but it wasn't that big a deal. The Fell Wyverns I could pretty easily deal with. Everyone doubled them because they have low speed cap, and most people one-rounded, actually with good accuracy. The Wyvern Riders, on the other hand, were a little bit trickier because Excalibur routinely had 70 to 80% hit rates, but by now that's Xenologue. You know the fucking drill. When it came time for the final confrontation, it was mostly just boring. The super weapon that was supposed to kill Nil now dealt 15 damage thanks to the Marth bonuses, and Lodestar Rush brought this up to about 40 out of 80, so I couldn't get a single health bar even, but you know, whatever, who cares? I human wave tactics because Phoenix mode, baby mode, cheater mode. At this point, I don't care about the broken dignity. I just want to be out of this fucking playthrough. I should note that if I didn't have Phoenix mode enabled, this would be a lot more frustrating because, once again, everyone has really low hit rates on nil. In fact, many of my characters had a sub 50% chance to deal single-digit damage. But yeah, I don't fucking care at this point. Our goat Jade landed the final blow, and we moved into the ending cutscenes, which someone paid me to watch all the way through, since I just wanted to end and go to bed. And that brings us to the end of the story, and the reveal that Nil is actually a sussy baka imposter, just like Gunter. In fact, there's a fucking exchange between Nil and Nell that really feels like the Gunter versus Corin exchange at the end of Revelation. The person we know as Nil is actually Rafal, a dragon who was identical to Nil, and then when Nil died, Rafal took Nil's place, pretending to be Nell's brother. And also, he wasn't actually evil. As it turns out, Nell's Dragonstone was cursed by Sombron in order to make Rafal, aka Nil, evil. So now Nil is like, okay, well, kill me because I'm gonna be evil if you don't kill me. And so then Nell kills herself and destroys the Dragonstone because she dies, and when a dragon dies, the Dragonstone is destroyed. And then that cures the curse, and so then Nil is nursing Nell back to life for 1,000 years, and the winds go into the alternate dimension with Alir, and then Nil and Nell come into the alternate dimension also, because time works differently at the bottom of the well. Did you get all that? Okay, cool, I don't care. This story was really bad. Like, I spent the beginning of this video defending the story of Engage, which I think gets quite a lot of undue criticism due to the fact that the internet likes being hyperbolic. If something is bad, it has to be the absolute worst, and if something is good, it has to be the absolute best. But I genuinely think the gameplay and story of Fel Xenologue are just so bad, and they intermingle with each other. The issues that they have sort of compound upon each other. This is the opposite of fun, and I can confirm that yes, forcing myself to go through it has lowered my opinion of Fire Emblem Engage overall. Because while the most glaring flaws in Fel Xenologue are isolated to the campaign, like the enemy mage cannoneers and whatnot, I can't help but notice areas in the main campaign where the same level of inattention that led to issues in Fel Xenologue seems to have come up again. Such as the weirdness around Diamant's and Amber's starting position, or Saphir getting one-rounded by warped-in Cavaliers on turn 1. The inability to check ranges from those same warp Cavaliers. The frustration that comes from enemy spam on maps like 25 and 26. The low percentage crit that so many enemies just randomly have. And the terrible starting inventories units are forced to deal with on their join maps. These were not the worst elements of Fel Xenologue, but they were present, and they are also present in Fire Emblem Engage main game. I still think it is in the top 50% of Fire Emblem titles. I'd much rather play it than any of the Game Boy Advance games, for example. But once you see the glaring issues highlighted as starkly as Fel Xenologue does, it's hard to put that genie back in the bottle. Although, maybe that's just recency bias. Maybe if I give Engage a little bit of time and return with fresh eyes, I'll like it better in a year or two. Or heck, maybe I won't, and maybe that's okay. I've actually been thinking a lot about how replaying games can lower our estimation of them. Sure, there are some games that get better on replay, either because you notice more details that you didn't on the first time, or you achieve a level of mastery that allows you to engage with some cool systems. But as the saying goes, familiarity breeds contempt, and the same experience repeated ad nauseum just becomes less fun. You spend too much time with the same campaign, and it's going to become boring. But thankfully, Fire Emblem has a ton of campaigns for me to choose from. Not just because of the 17 mainline games, but because of the incredibly robust ROM hacking community. In fact, Fire Emblem might just be the series that has the most custom campaign hacks out of any in the world. The only franchise I can think of as coming close is Pokemon. But even then, most of the custom campaigns are closer to remixes of vanilla games. They don't create their own region and story and whatnot. Some do, but most don't. Meanwhile, with Fire Emblem, there are a ton of hacks that feature all new mechanics, settings, stories, and characters, to the extent that I find it unlikely I will ever get bored of the ROM hacking scene. Whether it's the goofiness of Burger King, the multi-faction story of Vision Quest, the high school cringe of The Last Promise, or the political intrigue of Dream of Five, it feels like there's always something new around the corner. And well, I just think that's swell. Thank you to my patrons: Eris, Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Girlboss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Thaythom, Andu, Reflect, A Clever Username of Lies, YLO1, George Grenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, Floahay, Faulty Videos, Lyra, Toaster But Really, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Just Riley, Belle Wenska, Diesyke, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Arif Emblem, Adele, Gabe the Green, Control Tejas, Roman Kormancic, Knick Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Some Trades, and especially my Jagans, Autumn Kelsey, and Lilzabeth. Also, a second and even bigger shout out to Thick Molder for paying me $2,000 for this torture. You can also thank him in the comment section for making this video possible. In fact, today's comment code word is thank you Molder. So make sure you include that in your comment, that way I know that you made it to the end of the video. If you're interested in joining the names on screen, there is a link to my Patreon down below. That way I can further financially justify the torture I inflicted upon myself by playing Fel Xenologue. But regardless of what you do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.